Welcome to another edition of Conversations with CASA. My name is Vicki Spriggs, and I'm the CEO of Texas CASA. My guest today is Jamie Bernstein, who is the Assistant Director of the Supreme Court of Texas Children's Commission. Jamie, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Vicki.
Absolutely. Today we're going to be talking about dual status youth. So, Jamie, let's start with the definition of a dual status youth.
Well, I'll start out by saying that in Texas, we don't have a definition, and that's something we're working towards. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But some of the national research that we've seen from other jurisdictions, you've heard terms crossover. That could be any youth that's in juvenile justice and child welfare at any point in time. Dual status is really a more refined term to talk about, is it concurrent, is it not concurrent? Is it historical involvement with child welfare or juvenile justice? What's the pathway? But in short, what we're thinking about when we think about dual status youth is someone who touches both systems at some point in time.
Super. Which gets to be fairly complicated because you have a probation system that doesn't necessarily communicate with the Child Protective Services system and vice versa. And so I imagine there are lots of problems that pop up here.
Well, the systems function very differently in Texas. In large part, we're still state administered on the child welfare side, and probation is locally run through the local probation departments, although they do have some support from TJJD. It just operates very differently. The terms are different. The way we think about the child is different. In one situation, the child is a victim of abuse or neglect, and in the other, it's really about them committing an offense or potentially committing an offense. Or there's also a child in need of supervision, which is those status offenders staying out past curfew or having other violations that really are more by the nature of their age. So it does get very complicated really fast.
Yeah, so because it is complicated, there's the whole issue of outcomes, right? Because I would imagine that outcomes get a little more complicated at this point because the systems are going like this. Each with good intentions working for the child, but each one. So what do you see in terms of outcomes for dual status youth?
Well, the national research shows us that dual status youth have higher incidence of mental health and substance use issues. There's a disproportionate representation of females and African American youths, even compared to their single system counterparts. There's an overrepresentation in those two groups. We also know that the outcomes in both systems are poor, that there's higher recidivism rate, there's longer stays in detention on the juvenile side, and on the child welfare side, we have more placement instability as well as poor permanency outcomes.
You know, I'm asking you these questions like I don't know some of this, but the fact of the matter is, having worked in the juvenile probation system for a long time, the other issue that I know exists is if you have the instability of when if the child is in long-term probation detention or residential care, when they come out and the question is where do they go, that creates a whole nother level of drama in the child's life. So what is the Children's Commission's role in working on this issue?
That's a great question. So this is pretty new for us. Traditionally, we've only worked on child welfare issues, but in 2018, the Judicial Council, which is really the policy-making body for the judicial branch in Texas, made a recommendation for the Children's Commission to study the issue of dual status youth and how we're serving them. And we are staffing that. It began in July of 2019, and it'll go through December of 2020. And the task force is charged with defining the population, so really starting with who are we talking about when we're talking about dual status youth, and then what are the judicial practices around serving those youth? What are the training needs for judges, lawyers, advocates, and others in our state around serving dual status youth? And any other recommendations that may be needed to improve those outcomes that we talked about. Because I think the inverse is true. When the systems do talk and do work together, we can have really great outcomes for this youth and maybe utilize resources from each of the systems to help support the child and the family better.
So one piece already that could happen is when there is a dual status child who has a CASA volunteer assigned, that CASA ought to reach out to the local juvenile probation department, find out who that probation officer is, and see how they might be able to coordinate, I would imagine.
That's absolutely right. That's something that we've talked about already in the task force and in the work groups, is what could the role of the CASA and the guardian ad litem be to support that youth on both the child welfare and the juvenile justice side.
Super. And so You talked about training. Right now, it's the assessment of what types of training would be available for the different entities involved. Are there trainings that currently exist?
So we've identified training opportunities that already exist, standing conferences that kind of exist in one world or another, in the child welfare side or the juvenile side. But what we're trying to do is develop a curriculum that can be utilized through all different stakeholder groups that can really raise awareness on dual status youth and help really educate everybody in the community about how to identify them and how to serve them.
Excellent. Excellent. So, and you might have said this, but how did the commission get involved?
We became involved because the Judicial Council suggested that we study this issue and report on it, and we'll report out on it in December of 2020. But we also know that the crossover youth practice model, which comes out of Georgetown University, has been implemented here in Travis County as well as Bexar County, and it's in implementation, early implementation in Harris County. It's also been brought to Dallas and Tarrant County and El Paso County in the past. And so we've learned a lot from those large jurisdictions that are using a crossover youth practice model. They've developed business rules and protocols and MOUs and really engaged the judicial branch on how to serve crossover youth. So we're learning from those jurisdictions, but the point of this task force is also to supplement that to those rural jurisdictions or mid-sized jurisdictions who may not have the crossover youth practice model in place, but may want to be able to identify and serve these youth.
Super. So it seems like as community-based care rolls out, because it is community-based, that might facilitate some of that conversation and exchange of information.
Yes, and we are looping in the SSCCs into this conversation as well. They'll be part of the task force and the work group conversations.
Super. So do we know numbers? Like how many kids in care in the child under CPS are also in the juvenile probation system?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And what we're doing is starting with the definition, because until we know how we define the population, it's hard to categorize how many we have. You know, like I talked about earlier, it would really be looking at, I think the most common scenario is a previous child welfare case, and a current juvenile case is usually when they're identified. And so we need to track that information and see what that really looks like. I think when most people think of dual status youth, they're thinking of the child who's simultaneously involved in both systems, and that may not be as commonly occurring. That's what the national research is telling us.
Okay, good deal. If you're a CASA volunteer watching this, what else would a CASA volunteer need to know to better serve their child who is in both systems?
What I would suggest is just keep doing what you're doing, which is being that voice for the child, being the continuity in their life, being a supportive adult. Involvement in the juvenile justice system is complex. There's often a lot of reasons for that behavior. We know we've learned so much about trauma through the years and how sometimes that acting out can be a result of what that child is going through. It could happen after a visit or, there's so many explanations. And so just being that person in that child's life, providing that continuity and support, and making sure that their voice is heard throughout the process.
Super. And because we do, in the CASA arena, talk about and train on trauma-informed care and trauma-informed approaches, I think that maybe the CASA volunteer could be very helpful in working with that probation officer about tone and body language and how that might trigger something in a child. So, yeah.
And that may not be information they otherwise have.
Right. Any last thoughts?
Just want to say thank you to you and to all the Volunteer Network for all you're doing and for paying attention to this issue. I can tell you from our perspective, we're doing our work to study it and try and make recommendations for improvement for our state.
Super. Well, thank you for your work, Jamie, and thank you for always being a friend to Texas CASA and a supporter of the CASA Network. You're always at our conferences and you're always available with great information and a resource for us. So thank you very much for joining us and for everything that you do for us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us with this edition of Conversations with CASA. We'll see you next time.